Hello and welcome to KPod, the podcast about Korean Americans in arts and culture. I'm Juliana Sohn, a photographer.
And I'm Catherine Hong, a writer and editor. Today we're speaking with Soyoung Lee, a specialist in Asian art who was appointed Chief Curator at the Harvard Art Museums this past September. Lee built her career at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which she joined in 2003. She was the museum's first curator for Korean art, and over the next 15 years went on to organize a number of critically acclaimed exhibitions. Now at the Harvard Art Museums, Lee will be expanding far beyond the boundaries of Korean art, overseeing the university's 3 museums, which encompass art from nearly all parts of the world, from ancient times to the present. As such, she's certainly one of the most prominent Korean Americans in the museum world. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
One of the first questions I'd like to ask you is, in our initial email exchange, you said, well, I'm not sure I consider myself a Korean American. Then Kathy told me that you had grown up not in Korea or in America, and you've lived in international cities. So could you tell us a little bit about your background?
Sure. So my father was a diplomat for South Korea, and my siblings and I were all born in Jakarta, Indonesia. And in fact, I spent the first 5 years of my life in Indonesia. And so we moved around quite a bit. I did spend some time in Korea. We also lived in Stockholm, Sweden, where we attempted to learn a little bit of Swedish. We lived in London, England, from about the age of 10 for about 3 years. So that's when I first learned English and had a lovely British accent. Actually, I probably had a terrible Cockney accent. I used to tell my mother, apparently, all 3 of us, when we would come home from school, we'd say, Oma, that's not how you pronounce it. It's pa-o, without the T's. She had to get our neighbor to tell us that you do, in fact, pronounce the T's. But after that, we moved to the States, to Southern California, near Los Angeles. And although everybody loved the British accent, I was a teenager and didn't want to be different, so lost that accent pretty quickly. And so subsequently, I've lived in California, in New York area, and now I call Cambridge and the Boston area partly home as well.
And how did you decide to choose Korean art or Asian art?
You know, that serendipity, actually. I went into college. I went to Columbia University, and I went to college thinking that I was going to major in English, another very practical subject. I didn't like the English major requirements. Columbia had, and I believe they still do, a core program. So there are certain courses that you have to take, one of which was the art humanities, or as it's affectionately known, Art Hum. I mean, I had been exposed to art as part of my father's job, promoting culture, particularly Korean art and culture, but I didn't really understand that art history existed as a discipline, as an academic discipline, until I went to college and was exposed to Art Hum, which was mostly, sort of the greatest hits of Western art history, from the Parthenon to Picasso. But it really changed my life, in the sense that opened my eyes. I took more art history courses, became a major in it, and realized that it's something I love and I'm good at.
How did you end up becoming a curator of Korean art?
So my exposure to Korean art prior to college was mostly through my father's job, where he dealt with Korean art and culture in terms of promoting it in the various countries that we were in. As an undergraduate at Columbia, there's really nobody teaching Korean art. In fact, Asian art is a relatively smaller field than the rest of the field of art history. But I did spend a semester in Seoul as a kind of an exchange program, and that's where I started learning in earnest the academic field of Korean art history. And even though I grew up all over the world, because my father was a diplomat, and with the sense that they will eventually go back to Korea, they had ingrained this sense in us that we are Koreans wherever we go, and that you were going to go back to live in Korea. So, they made sure that we learned the language and had a deep sense of what the contemporary culture is like. So I guess it seemed sort of natural to extend what I was familiar with, but take that to a deeper or maybe a higher academic level. And then in grad school, I specialized in both Japanese art, which was another love of mine, because there was a professor teaching who was open to my studying and researching the interconnection between Japanese and Korean art. And I did a lot of independent research. I went and lived in Korea and in Japan for about a 2-year period to do my dissertation research. But honestly, in terms of museum work, funny as it sounds, I, through graduate school, didn't really think about museum as a career option. And I thought I'd always teach, that I'd become a professor, be an academic. And it's really kind of, how life is 90% dumb luck and opportunity that opens up to you. So the Metropolitan Museum, right around the time I was, finishing up the dissertation, was looking for a Korean art curator. They had just opened their Korean gallery in 1998. And this was sometime in the early 2000s. And sort of right place, right time, I got lucky and I got hired as the Korean art curator and realized that I loved it. I love being in a museum. The best part is that you are dealing with actual art all the time. And you're also dealing with the public. And you're constantly thinking about, how do I translate what is so dear to me and what is so significant about the art and the culture that I know to those out there who may not know it as well as I do? How do I communicate that passion?
So that was your first job out of school?
It was my first real job. I had done some adjunct teaching. I mean, it was sort of like a dream job. If you want to be a curator, if you're an art historian, you want to end up at the Met. And I started at the Met. So
yes.
I was a lucky gal.
I have a question about the gallery itself. It's kind of small, windowless. I remember seeing it for the first time and thinking, the Koreans get this kind of maybe not the best real estate at the Met, though I can see why. How did that affect your job? How did you feel about the space you were given? You've put on some amazing shows in that space.
Thank you. Honestly, knowing what the field is like within museums and within the field of art history, it's actually amazing that there is a space dedicated to Korean art at the world's premier museum, the Metropolitan Museum. It's interesting that you say it's not, and it is a reaction that almost universally Koreans will have, whether Korean Americans and certainly Koreans coming from Korea. It's so small. But the windowless part, though, for much of art, especially light sensitive, and that includes almost all of Asian art, you can't really have windows. And you'll notice that all the galleries around it, none of them have windows. The reaction most non-Koreans have walking into that gallery, because it is so different and airy, even though it's small, it has a much more modernist aesthetic and is much more airy. And so most non-Koreans walking into that space love it relative to the galleries around it. But I was just, I was relatively young back then, my first real job at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So I was just really excited and happy to have space where you can show and play with. And really, when you think about it, Asia is one of the regions in museum spaces where they have galleries devoted to sort of, nations. I mean, you rarely go to museums that have gallery for French art or German art. Sometimes, but most of European art is divided into media. So you'll show, paintings from Northern Europe or something like that. So honestly, it was not a problem for me. I was happy to have the space. It is, in many ways, an ideal space to showcase Korean art. And when I organized a bigger exhibition in 2013 on Silla, Korea's Golden Kingdom, we got one of the largest special exhibition spaces in the Metropolitan Museum, which was also a huge honor and a real sort of point of pride.
So, I wanted to ask you, because the Korean galleries, it's all antiquities and historical artwork. And as a Korean American person. I was born in Korea, but grew up here. I went to Korean school on Sundays, and I hear these words like Silla and Pekje. It almost makes me associate it with something that is just so like kind of removed from me emotionally. And I would love to engage more, but I feel like I have this like block. And did you find that other people had that, or what was your response to that?
So I would say in general, especially now, I think more people are aware of and perhaps are drawn to contemporary art of today, art that's created, by artists around them. Even though I think, myself included, many people will say, I don't really understand contemporary art. So much of it is abstract, not only abstract, but sort of arbitrary. It's more about the concept than the actual form. On the other hand, it's hot. It's the trendy thing. It's what everybody wants. It's what people are collecting. And it feels more current and immediate and something that is about your times. So for those of us whose specialty or who are trying to communicate art from prior to, say, even 1900s or even the very ancient periods, there is a certain competition, let's say, to vie for the attention of people who are easily drawn to the more sort of sexy contemporary art. Then there's also, as you say, the element of, I think, for Korean Americans who feel that the traditional history and culture is removed from their life and their life stories, there is certainly also that, I think, barrier as well. Korea is part of my tradition, and yet it's not something I've grown up with necessarily or that I know so well. And so why is it relevant?
Yes. Like I don't see myself in that, even though I can appreciate it on a certain level, but I don't emotionally connect with it.
Well, I hope that you'll be able to emotionally connect with it. And I think that is the job of a curator. And one hopes not that everyone will emotionally connect with the material that you're working with. Perhaps your connection is with Cezanne, or maybe it's with ancient Greek vases. And that's okay. Just because you were born in Korea doesn't mean you have to love Korean art. As long as you're passionate about some of the other arts, yes. That's okay. I won't hold that against you. But so that is a challenge, to draw in the Korean Americans for whom they do identify Korea as part of the heritage, but maybe they feel removed from it. How do we communicate that? And it is really through the work. So that's where selection of what I put on view and the kinds of exhibitions that I bring together. And I think the exhibition Silla, Korea's Golden Kingdom, I hope, even though it's such a far away time. So we're talking, 500 to 700 AD. That was a really exciting time in Korean history. And part of the visual culture, material culture of that time is gold. I mean, who doesn't like gold? And it's the kind of the initial visual dazzle of all the gold regalia. And then when you come to understand that, the way, the exquisite artistry that goes into making it, and then learn a little bit about the people who use them, wore them, and that it's very much part of this rather unique and stunning burial culture. So I don't know if you've been to Gyeongju, but that's the southeastern part of Korea where many of these come from. And these burial mounds are rather unusual in global history. And so that element of it, I think, also attracts people.
As you're talking, I'm realizing that maybe my lack of connection or disinterest in some of these traditional artwork has to do with the fact that I don't know a lot of the history. So, growing up here, you see Civil War reenactments or movies, and I've seen some videos walking by while my parents are watching of people in these traditional outfits, and but it's not something that, besides in textbooks, that I see in pop culture or I've seen around in magazines profiled that makes me connect with it in a way. So I guess my initial barrier must be lack of information, lack of education.
But that's true for anyone for many things, right? So I think I would hope that museums, in particular places like the Met, but also, my new place, the Harvard Art Museums, with its breadth of collections and the kinds of exhibitions that they're able to put together and the level of expertise that they have in the staff, that's what it's for. That's what museums are for, where you go to learn about the histories, perhaps of your own, but also of others, around people around the world, but you do it through the immediacy of the object, of an actual object or an artwork, to draw you in, and that through those experiences, you learn to peel back the layers of the history that you might have thought was just either too distant, too dense, or not interesting enough. But in fact, once you start to get at it layer by layer, and once you find the objects that really pull you in, that's how you learn to sort of love this stuff.
I have a question about your time traveling to Korea. Obviously, you had to travel a lot to get these loans representing the Met. I always imagined that you were treated like a super VIP. Please tell me I'm right. Give me some examples of what sort of trips you had and what it was like being the curator of Korean art at the Met and going to Korea.
Especially since I know the Korean government and arts, there's such huge push to get it out there from the government.
Absolutely. So, particularly in the last 5 years, even decade, South Korean government has been incredibly proactive in promoting Korean culture abroad. It's the way that the Japanese government and corporations in the 80s and 90s, they then sort of fell back, and Korea is now kind of the rising star of Asia in terms of promoting both its ancient culture, but also contemporary. With K-pop and what have you, K-drama. There's a big push.
K-beauty.
Yeah, K-beauty, exactly. I know so little about that. So going to Korea as a curator for Korean art at the Met is the ultimate experience. I'm not treated like I'm, Beyonce, but it's partly the Met name, but it's also that I had built up a relationship with all of these people at various different institutions, as well as the government. So they're always welcoming, negotiating for loans of major works from Korea to travel, even as they're so willing to and wanting to push the promotion of Korean art. It's a delicate dance because, as custodians of these treasures, you want to make sure that they are protected. Safety of the artwork and longevity of the artwork. Preservation of the artwork is a major concern. But, most of my colleagues in Korea have been very open about the ideas that I would develop in terms of presenting them here, because they understood that I got it. I get Korean culture. I understand their concerns, but that I work and live in and know the American culture to best sort of present Korean art to the audience. In other words, how can we present Korean art so that people can understand and appreciate it, so that it doesn't feel, just something that's in a textbook or something that's just boring.
Did they ever have like a specific agenda or an ask? We would love it if you would promote this aspect. Or
Sure, yes. Everybody has their own ideas, and the government in particular, at particular moments. And as you know, with government positions, they're bureaucratic positions, so people rotate all the time. And so and I'm going a little off topic, but when one organizes an exhibition, it usually takes somewhere around 4 to 5 years from conception to it actually opening. And in Korea, so I would start with for example, one director of the National Museum in Korea. By the time the show opens, it's the third director that I've gone through, and so forth. But everyone has their own ideas. They're generally, though, respectful of the fact that I'm the one who would know best what would best appeal to the audiences. But for example, when we in 2018 spring did the exhibition on Diamond Mountains, Kumgangsan, the initial impetus was that the South Korean Ministry of Culture asked if the Met would be interested in participating in some sort of project around the time of the Pyeongchang Winter Olympics, because what a moment to, sort of promote Korean culture around that. And so they had ideas about, well, what kind of exhibition might you do? Wouldn't it be nice if it had something to do with sports? But that's not really going to work. So, we came up with the idea of a site in Korea that is actually not too far from Pyeongchang. That's probably the most iconic mountains in Korea that today happens to be North Korea. So you get a little bit of the current politics in there that I think actually did work in terms of getting attention for the exhibition at the time of the opening. But yes, so there are often demands that you work around, you work with, but it's been really thrilling, the welcome and the warm reception.
Did they try to bribe you? Did they take you out to fancy meals? Did you always fly first class?
What hotel did you stay in?
First of all, they don't pay for it for most of it. So there are met sort of rules and policies about how much money we can spend in travels and so forth. But I mean, yes, they took me out to nice dinners. That's how Koreans are, right? We had to dinners that were like multi-courses, but they do that for most visitors coming to Korea.
And do you feel like, I think of Korea as still a very patriarchal society. Did you encounter any kind of attitudes
That's a good question. That's an interesting question. I suppose certainly when I first started, but I was already in my 30s. I wasn't a young. So I think when I was a college student, a graduate student studying in Korea, it was perhaps a little bit more patronizing. But it's also, if they respect you as a scholar of the field, I think there's less of that. And I would say that I'm respectful, but I don't come across as a meek Korean woman. So in that attitude, I think I don't think they would overstep.
No, I wanted to go back to when you were traveling with your father. Mm-hmm. I think it's interesting because when he's a diplomat and he's clearly representing the government of Korea, but the fact that he was also promoting Korea culturally. And then were you expected to be sort of this model example of what Korean family and Korean children were?
I'm not sure about the external expectation, but there was certainly, I think, within my parents, they were very conservative and traditional. And it's interesting because not everybody, but I think this occurs with people who, either diplomats or otherwise immigrants, who leave the motherland, right? I mean, my parents were always meant to go back, and they did. But your perception of what's Korean culture and what is right is frozen in the moment that you leave, and it doesn't progress. So in fact, you become a lot more and Korea was fast changing, as you'll recall. Yes. And so you end up being more conservative. Yes. And in some ways, as a diplomat representing Korea, you want that gravitas, and you want to be sure that you're properly representing. And so that
you err on the side of conservative.
You err on the side of being sort of conservative or traditional. But, that hit me. I didn't really question it. In some ways, probably because I didn't really understand how quickly Korea was changing. And by nature, I do like tradition. And so I wasn't all that rebellious against it. But I remember in college, so once I had been at Columbia for a while and my parents had gone back to Korea. So one summer in college, and my parents were still here. So I was going back to spend a summer with my relatives, my very large extended family. And I hadn't been back to Korea in a few years. My mom was very concerned that I don't dress like the Americans. not that I was dressing all that,
What was the year?
Radically. Sometime in the 80s, I would say, late 80s or early 90s. And so I arrive in Seoul, and I'm the most conservatively dressed young kid, 20-something. And so Korea had, in the meantime, surpassed, in many ways, even what New York was like. I realized at that point how the concept of Korea and Korean culture, certainly of contemporary Korean culture that I had been living with, was not the reality in
Yes.
Korea at that
What
time.
an amazing experience.
Yes.
So I want to ask you about your family. I know that you're married to professor of history at Princeton, Stephen Kotkin, and you have 2 kids who are teenagers.
Yes.
What do you think their interest is in the work that you did for 15 years with the Met? Were they fascinated by Korean art? Did they think it was boring?
That's a really good question. I'm not really sure. It was always, so in many ways, it was just a part of their lives in a way. And I did take them to the Met often. They were more resistant the older they got. My daughter is very much into visual arts. She's an artist herself. So she was more interested than my son. They came to every exhibition opening that I had, which they thought was very cool. Even the most recent one, where now they're teenagers, they agreed to come and they liked it. And my daughter actually then spends time really looking at the works. And the most recent exhibition, she was really, the opening is kind of frenzied and it's fun and there's a lot of people. And I kept turning around like, where did she go? Where did she go? And she's off in the corner looking at the paintings. So it was gratifying to know that this material, as an artist, that she was interested. Perhaps a little bit because it was what mom did, but that the works, she told me that the paintings themselves she really liked. So that was gratifying to know. It was funny. One time recently, my son did say, so what do you do exactly as a curator? So I tried to explain to him, I'm a scholar like your father who teaches and writes books. But I'm one of the main things I do is I organize these exhibitions that you come to, which means that, I come up with an idea and I find where the best objects are and we borrow them and we show them for a certain time and so forth. And then with my move to the Harvard Art Museums, my friends, others say, oh, are your children so proud of you? Honestly, with kids this age, they're just so wrapped up in themselves. I don't know if they really think about their parents, right? But I had a birthday recently and my children gave me a card and my daughter's the one who wrote it collectively for the 2 of them. But it was very sweet. And they said, I am commuting back and forth between New York and Cambridge. And they wrote, I'm starting a new job at Harvard, must be like starting high school, like really hard. And we're so proud of you. So maybe they have some sense of what it is that mom does and that they feel some sense of pride when they're not thinking only about themselves and their social life.
So your position at Harvard now, I know it's global artwork from everywhere. Is it also like non-contemporary historical?
So the Harvard Art Museums relatively recently, in 2014, opened a new building. There used to be 3 distinct museums in 3 separate buildings. The Fogg Art Museum, the Sackler Museum, and the Bush Reisinger, that now have come together under one building. But each of those museums had very distinct areas. So the Harvard Art Museums covers much of global art, not everything. There are holes. The Americas, Europe, Asia, ancient Mediterranean, Germanic focused, modern, and we do come up to the contemporary period. So contemporary art is very much part of not only the collections of Harvard Art Museums, but also in its programming. So I would say that the transition from the Met and my previous role to the position at the Harvard Art Museums was really thrilling for me because I had reached a stage in my career where, I will always love Korean art and will want to stay, active in my kind of scholarly pursuit and the personal interest. But I'm curious about other cultures as well. And Japanese art was one of my first loves in graduate school. And to be freer to explore those areas, to learn about such vast areas of the world through the expert curators who work with me. And then also to engage with contemporary art. It is an area that I've dabbled in the sense that in my previous work, in some of my exhibitions, I've pulled in contemporary artists, Korean artists, whose works in different ways reflect the traditions. But it's really interesting and exciting to think about what the Harvard Art Museums might do with contemporary art. As I said before, contemporary art is sexy, trendy. It's what everybody does. But for a museum that is fairly encyclopedic, and like Harvard Art Museums is part of the university, but it's also part of the Greater Boston area, which has many museums, in fact, including one that's dedicated to contemporary art only. So what can we do that's not what everybody else does, but that might be a bit different, that might bring a fresh perspective, that may allow people who experience contemporary art in various ways, say at the MFA or the Contemporary Art Museum or elsewhere, or in the galleries that show artists of the region, what else can they experience at the Harvard Art Museums that they can't experience elsewhere? And then also the other half of my role is to meld that with the ambitions of the individual curators who work there, and to mentor them and to mentor the students. That's part of not only the Harvard community, but the community around it, the college students, graduate students, the high school students.
So do you have any advice for young Korean Americans who may want to get involved in curatorial arts?
Yes. Let's say post-bac, thinking about graduate school, come to me and say, should I go into art history, PhD, so that I can go work at a museum and become a curator? And I say to them, do you have any other talents? You might want to think about pursuing other fields that are more lucrative and very straightforward and practical. Because this is there aren't going to be a whole lot of opportunities, and you want to make sure, graduate school is a significant investment. And it also, I know that curating in museums may seem dazzling and fun, and yes, it can be, but it's actually, to be a curator, you're a scholar in the field. So it's not just all about the dazzle and the fun and
the openings.
The openings, they're fun, but you need to have substance to be able to back that up. So you need to be a specialist in something. And so you do need to go to graduate school. It's an investment. So make sure that this is what you want. And that if, let's say, you didn't end up being in a museum, that you still would want that life of scholarship. Because otherwise, go do something else that you're good at. So you can be in a museum in many capacities, actually. Curators are not the only professions in the museums. There are conservators, people who work to preserve works. There are book designers, graphic designers, exhibition designers. That's a really exciting part. Digital media technology is now becoming more and more an important and integral part of museums. So you can be a techie and work at a museum too. So there are many different professions possible in a museum, but if you want to be a curator, you really, again, it is about being a scholar. So you better be sure that you like spending time with books and in libraries and in fields and sites where you have to actually go and see the works, and thinking about history as well as contemporary.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your new work and your experiences with us.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
KPod is a production of KoreanAmericanStory.org. Our producer is Kevin Park, our editor is AJ Valente, and our executive producer is HJ Lee. You can email us with comments and suggestions at kpod@koreanamericanstory.org. You can see my portraits of all our podcast guests at koreanamericanstory.org. You can follow me on Instagram at Juliana_Sohn. For news and updates on KPod, follow Korean American Story on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook.